for having me on. It's a pleasure to have.
Absolutely. The audience knows I've played, and I will play it again, your clip. We have a shorter version of where you're declaring for humanity that our human genetics, God-given genetics, are being poisoned, and that this is the purpose. So I wanted to start, with that in mind, and we can get into some other subjects. I also want people to know your credentials. So take a moment or two and let people know where your studies, your work, and what your focus is and your expertise.
Sounds good. I started doing a cell biology and physiology degree at McGill in 1995, and I finished in 1999. So my knowledge of cell biology, genetics, molecular biology, it's from the 90s. This is 22-year-old, 23-year-old information, so it's nothing new to the scientific community. So we'll be going over some things briefly about what I know of cell biology and how this incident with these injections, these mRNA injections, it could not have been a mistake. This had to have been planned.
Yeah, and for those experts like yourself that understand, you can narrow it down to intent because there would be no other reason to use this. And I think many of us have been skeptical since the beginning of this rollout, and there were so many signs. It's forced. It's either your life, your military career, your job, feeding your family, or this shot. And so we knew something was really, really wrong. Now we understand it a little bit more. It is a worldwide in lockstep operation. But I want to focus first, like I said, on this issue of the human genome being poisoned. Maybe we can kind of take a 30,000-foot view and ask what your thoughts are in terms of, why do they want us to have our genome damaged for years to come, which sounds like pain, suffering. We don't even know what is going to become in future generations that are born of these modified genes.
I can't describe it as anything other than a sick and twisted experiment. The amount of money, the amount of power, political, economic, and biological power, the power has led to a complete loss of morality, of ethics.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to wonder if they're just experimenting with the human genome for our entire species just for the sake of it. I can't tell what their objective is. If it was direct population control, we already have the technology for population collapse ending weapons of mass destruction, right? So Is it just population control? I don't think so. If it was just a push a button and all of a sudden they have the human population of the entire planet reduced to whatever 500 million or whatever number they want it to, they have the capability to do that through chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, maybe even biological weapons, deadlier ones than the ones we've seen. But this genetic manipulation, I can't explain it. It's being done just for the sake of it, to prolong the misery. I don't know. This is
a mystery.
Is pure evil. This is a crime that we've never seen in history. Ever.
Yeah, absolutely. You said in one of your clips, the clip, you gave this speech in front of the University of British Columbia, that I know you wanted to make the point that you wish you had seen it sooner. Sometimes it's not possible to see it sooner because you were all feeling in the dark from our different levels of expertise. These are not disclosing companies, right? But I wanted to ask you. You mentioned that there was an expert who kind of distracted you. Are you able to say who that expert was, and did they realize that they made a mistake, or was it intentional?
I don't want to mention them by name, but this was early on back in, I believe it was November, December, and I was involved in a multi-expert Zoom call. And around November last year, I recalled all this 20, 21, 22-year-old information that I had learned when I was doing my degree at McGill. And it had to do with something called reverse transcriptase, where the body has a certain enzyme that can turn mRNA, or any RNA for that matter, into DNA. And once something's been turned into DNA, it's allowed to enter the nucleus of the cell, which is like the soul of the cell, the heart of the cell. That's where all the important information is kept. And if the DNA of the cell is spoiled or tampered with, then you have a chance for that cell to turn cancerous.
I see.
Right? And cancerous in the sense that it doesn't know when to stop growing. It'll just keep growing until it kills the whole body. So that's why, if you look at it in a biological sense, every cell in the body, every cell on any eukaryotic organism, whether it's a protozoa, plant, or animal, or multicellular, bacteria or parasite, every cell on this planet knows that DNA is very important. And that's why DNA is kept in a specific protected location inside the cell, because it is that important. So once something has been turned into DNA, now it has permission to enter the nucleus of the cell. What it can do into the nucleus of the cell is it can either insert itself into the DNA, so it changes the information in the DNA. Depending on where it changes the information of the DNA, it can either have an expressed effect, like you'll see the effect right away, or it can remain hidden in the DNA to cause changes not in the cell that had the change done to it, but in the children and grandchildren generations of the cell. So this is a long-term effect. This is a change to the makeup, to the instructions on how to make other cells, how to divide, how to proliferate. So this is a change that can be permanent for that entire cell line.
And so when this expert said, well, maybe it's not this, it's probably this over here, so don't worry about it. Do you think that was an earnest error, or do you think in retrospect they might have been trying to throw you off?
I suspect it was an earnest error in the sense that this expert's focus of expertise was so hyper-focused that in whatever cell lines he spent decades researching on, there was probably not very much reverse transcriptase. Whether it was a monkey kidney cell line or some other type of, we call them immortal, but really they're cancerous cell lines because they never stop growing, they never die. Maybe that cell line didn't have reverse transcriptase. So because of a too narrow focus of knowledge, he may not have realized that, other cell lines, other non-cancerous cell lines in living human beings, living animals, actually do have active reverse transcriptase. And sometimes that can happen to researchers when they read too much on one small topic and don't spend enough time looking at the world around them, right? Other fields, even within the field of molecular biology, looking at physics, chemistry, looking at the organism as a whole.
No, I understand. And I think it's to your credit, it was only because you said, look, 20 years of genetic understanding, it's not like there's anything new under the sun with regard to how it works. So to your credit, you were able to, even though it was a few months later, say, wait a minute, we've got to get this out because it is playing a role. So, thank God for that. I wanted to ask you about, we talked about, maybe we have, I don't know if you're aware, there was a document that was released last year. It was a communication between Pfizer and the EMA. We've chatted briefly about it, but I wanted to get more of your take on, in that communication, what the end result was that Pfizer was able to negotiate, and I'm sure the other companies probably did too eventually, that they could have part of their formula undeclared, so that everything that went out in these vials, a percentage up to 50%, they were allowed to leave undeclared, which in one other part of that communication, they did acknowledge that there would be some shorter in what they called incomplete RNA strands. And so there leaves open that possibility that I wanted you to talk about a little bit on what those could be. Could they be coded for something? And could they be coded for something as bad as the spike protein? And what are your thoughts around that?
Well, that's the big unknown, right? What we had admitted by Pfizer is that only half the mRNA in these injections is actually spike protein mRNA that will, through a very indirect means, stimulate people to develop antibodies to spike proteins. So if only half of it is mRNA for spike proteins, what's the other half of the mRNA? Right? They could be putting anything in there. We've had one leak where a Moderna production line engineer claimed that there was 2 separate ovarian proteins associated with ovarian failure added to the mRNA cocktail that's being given in these injections. And the biggest crime here is that the government has allowed a company to give human beings, men and women, an unknown substance. Mm-hmm. A cocktail, they say, well, it's mRNA, but that's only half the story. The other half of the story is it may contain proteins that cause women to be infertile. What is the purpose of that? Right? And especially since reverse transcriptase has been known since I was an undergraduate university student. So this has been known for over 25 years. The presence of reverse transcriptase means it must have been known. Every researcher, every geneticist, every molecular biologist that worked on this project would have known that any mRNAs that are injected have the potential to turn into DNA, and if they turn into DNA, they will change the genes of whoever took that injection. So there's the problem. A whole bunch of people might start getting cancers, unusual cancers, because their DNA in their body was changed. But that's only part of the problem. The really big problem is what happens in the next generation, the child generation, the grandchild generation. Because if you believe their statistics, about 5 billion people on this planet have taken this injection. Mm-hmm. About half of those 5 billion people are women. So 2.5 billion. About half, I'm going to say this is a rough estimate.
Sure.
Half of those 2.5 billion women on this planet are women that are capable of becoming mothers. Women that are capable of bearing children because they're young enough and then their bodies are still capable of holding a fetus, raising a fetus, and giving a birth to a baby. So that's about 1.25 billion people in this world. Now we know from the latest releases of the Pfizer post-marketing survey that the miscarriage and stillbirth rate after getting this injection was incredible. Maybe even up to 90%.
Let me stop you and ask you a question about that. Why isn't the public seeing the effect of an 84 to 90% miscarriage rate?
That's a really good question. You know, we really have to look through vital statistics of every country, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of, I hate to say it, obstetricians and doctors who deal with giving, helping women give birth that say, it's just bad luck. Miscarriages happen all the time. It's nothing unusual. Mm. And because, it was thought prior to this pandemic that up to 30% of pregnancies end up in miscarriages. Most of the time it's not noticed because it's so early in the pregnancy, it actually happens with the next period. That it's been normalized that, don't worry about it. Try again next time. It's not a big deal. And the medical community has been a big part of normalizing the rate of miscarriages.
For sure.
So the fact that if there's all of a sudden increase in miscarriages, just through the setup of society the way it is, where people don't gather all together in communities and talk amongst us, ourselves as much as we used to in, even a century ago, 100 years ago, that a mother can have a miscarriage and she won't have another group of 10 or 20 mothers who would have said, oh, that's kind of unusual. That's twice in this year. Mm-hmm. Right?
Good point.
That would have been normalized by her contact with a healthcare provider who would have told her, oh, that's normal. But if you took it on a community scale, it's like, wow, because communities have been so divided and people don't like to talk about, oh, I had a miscarriage. It's
sure.
No, people won't talk to each other about it.
Yeah, you make some really good points. I want to just pivot a touch back to the post-generation, multi-generational effects of this. I mean, how are people going, what effect do you see long term? You talked a little bit about it in your speech where, it might not happen every generation. And, I don't want to get too into the technicality about recombinant DNA behavior, but, as you go down through generations, you reawaken dangerous genes. I mean, this is, how are we going to recover from this? The rate limiting step is the voluntary, and this is not a blame game, but they really have been very effective in getting those 5 billion injected, as you noted, voluntarily. Yes, there was coercion. There were some soft, hey, we're going to fire you. But for the most part, they really got people to belly up. And for that faction of people that just keeps going, they're just taking booster after booster. That's a big rate limiting step, right? And generationally, how are we going to identify, how will your great grandchildren be able to identify, that they don't want to procreate with someone who came down from this?
So this is the diabolical. This is worse than a mugging, where a mugger comes to you and says, your money or your life, right?
Yeah.
So this is your money or your job or your livelihood, or you have to take this injection. This is worse than that. This is money or your future. And not just your future, the future of your children and your grandchildren. So here's the mathematical problem. So let's say there was 1.25 billion mothers having babies, but the injection gave them a 90% infertility rate. That still leaves 125 million babies that were able to survive being a fetus, be born, and grow up in spite of the fact that their mother took the injection, the DNA altering injection. Now, the mechanism, spike proteins are highly toxic to DNA. So the fact that, and that's if it's just spike protein mRNA that's been put into these injections. I don't know what else has been put in, what the other 50% is.
Sure.
I have no idea. But it's probably quite accurate to say about 90% of the time, if a fetus's DNA has been altered to have the spike protein in it, that fetus won't survive pregnancy. Right?
I see.
You won't get a healthy baby at the end of that 9-month road.
Right. But some will.
But some will, because sometimes genes can get spliced into what we call introns, these are parts of the DNA that's kept for reference. It's not necessarily used, it's not turned into protein. So then that fetus's cell, which is dividing to make new arms, new legs, new ovaries, new testes, that cell is dividing and it doesn't know that, there's no signs that it has the spike protein gene hidden inside the library of genes that are contained. That means if you don't make any spike proteins, you don't get any of the cancers, you don't get any of the blood clots. That child, even though the mother was injected, might grow up to be a perfectly healthy, beautiful adult. But there's something hidden inside an intron, which is like the reference library of their DNA.
Right.
And if that spike protein gene is there hiding, and that beautiful adult goes on and has kids, during the process where a sperm and an egg meet, there's a very complicated process where the genes are shuffled. Genes that previously weren't expressed, like the gene for blue eyes or brown skin or curly hair, they suddenly get activated because it was there in the library.
Sure.
So you're not completely like your mom, you're not completely like your dad. Sometimes something that, maybe that your grandfather had silver hair, right? And he just had silver hair ever since he had
it shakes up the gene pool. It really shakes up the gene pool. Yeah, to keep it healthy.
Things that weren't there, that weren't features from 2-3 generations ago, get reawakened. And the problem is, what happens when that adult, that man or woman who thinks they're normal, because they feel normal, all their proteins are normal, tries to have a child, and in that gene reshuffling process,
it comes alive again. And we don't even know what it's going to come alive with, according to what you're saying. And also matching with the fact that 50% of it is undeclared. We don't know what's being passed down. I mean, in normal life, we never know either, but we certainly know that it's organic and God-given. It's a legacy of your family tree. But here, we have no idea what they intentionally did. We know what they've done so far, and it's pretty ugly. So who knows? Who knows? I wanted to ask you, Dr. Nagasse, in your expertise, really, because we're lucky to have somebody like you who's got this genetic, understanding. I get asked this question all the time. It's way over my head. But in your expertise, is there anything you can imagine, any way to stop or shut this off? This mRNA that's been, let's put the 50% aside and let's pretend that it's saline or nothing just for a minute. And is there any way to turn the others off? Is there any hope for that?
Not with the technology and science that I learned. To try and pull a segment of DNA out of every cell of someone's body, that's
too much.
That's not a scale of technology that I'm aware of, right? Yeah. And the thing is, if that spike protein gene is hiding in an unexpressed segment of the DNA, that person will look, act, and feel entirely normal. And, it might be one of these situations that you actually have to do a DNA test on someone's sperm or egg to find out whether or not this gene is hidden somewhere in their DNA. Right? Wow. Because you can't tell that just by looking at the person. It could be completely hidden.
Yeah.
Right?
Dr. Nagasse, we're at the end of this segment, and you've been graciously generous enough to stay on for a second segment. So I'm going to wrap it up here and ask everyone to just stay with us. We'll be back in the next segment with Dr. Daniel Nagasse. Thank you. What an amazing discussion with Dr. Nagasse. So many issues covered. But that wasn't the end of our discussion. There's a lot more ahead. You won't want to miss part 2 of my interview with him, which will air on Wednesday. I want to talk to you about some other issues like war, inflation, and $30 trillion in debt. It's looking like 2008 all over again under this administration. Millions of Americans watched their retirement savings just disappear back then, while those who invested in physical gold and silver were protected. And if you've got $50,000 or more in your IRA, 401k, or savings, you could be at risk again. But right now, thousands of Americans are using an IRS loophole to add physical gold and silver to their retirement savings. I want to suggest that you call 855-791-2619 to get a free gold IRA kit and learn how thousands are protecting their retirement savings with gold and silver. Protect your savings, and you could get $10,000 or more in free silver to do it. Goldco has an A+ rating from the Better Business Bureau and thousands of positive customer reviews, and they've helped place nearly $1 billion in precious metals. Yes, we could be looking at a recession far worse than 2008, So don't wait. Call my friends at Goldco today. That's 855-791-2619. That's 855-791-2619. Don't go anywhere. In the next segment, we're going to take a look at why the FDA has abdicated all of its responsibilities. And we're also going to talk about the Comirnaty fraud in my breaking news statement. We're going to dig into that a little bit more. And I've got some pictures you won't want to miss.